Okay, so we're going to dedicate this class this morning to the neshama of Yehuda Zev ben Zlata. I don't know his father's name. Can't remember. Known as Uncle Yudi, who passed away this morning.
Family name?
Gottesman, Mr. Reb Yudi Gottesman. Reb Yudi Gottesman. He told me once that he told many that he was once at the Rebbe for Yechidus in a private audience. And he asked the Rebbe many times. He was a chassid. So he asked the Rebbe what he had to do to become a chassid. What should I do to become a chassid? And the Rebbe told him to take the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, the abridged version of the Code Jewish Law, read it once, twice, 3 times, till it's completely absorbed within you. And that's what you need to do to be a chassid. Yeah. And indeed, he was a man of Allah. He was a very frum person. Very frum, very much by the book.
He lives in the area?
He lived 3 blocks away from my grandparents on Carlton, Kent, one of those 2 streets, the corner of not Legary, but Lavoie, right? Yeah. So the Shama should get all the rest that he needs, and I'm sure he's with the Rebbe. That's where he wants to be.
Sure, your grandfather.
Yep. We're there to greet him and bring him to the Fabrengen that's happening there. Yeah. So where did we leave off? We left off that if a person, well, let's get the principles again. Every time we come back, we have to go through the principles. The principles are: you may not leave the table when you're reading. That's not lucky. You're not allowed to leave the spot. You have to bench where you eat. You're not allowed to leave. On the other hand, there is a converging principle, which is almost somewhat paradoxically opposite, almost somewhat seem contradictory, is that if you do leave, your meal isn't over, because halacha says come back to bench. So therefore you shouldn't have left, but now that you did, your meal isn't over, and therefore if you were to eat bread in the new place, or come back and continue eating bread, no new bracha. Right? No new bracha. That, now, if the person's going for a mitzvah, that's why he's leaving, then he has that permissibility. But the entire reason why, at least according to one opinion, the reason why we tell you not to leave your spot without benching is because lest you forget. But if you're running to a mitzvah, we're not going to be concerned with lest you forget. So if you're sitting at your meal and you want to go next door for a zimun, you may do so long as you eat in a new place. Then we said that if the person is leaving for personal issues, he's just wants to say hello to someone, which in that case, we get back to the original 2 halachic principles that are converging. A, you shouldn't have left, but now that you did, your meal is not finished, right? And if you did that, and 2 things. A, when you left, you knew you were going to continue eating. If when you washed, you knew you were going to leave your place, then to begin with, you may do so, at least according to this opinion. But here, you thought you were staying till the end. You decided to go out. Now, when you went out, you knew you were going to be eating more. Number 1. Number 2, you didn't spend so much time as to make the food digest. That is when you don't need to make a new bracha ha'motzi, because you're still anchored halachically to your original meal. You knew you were going to continue eating when you left, and the food hasn't digested. But if you decided, look, I'm done eating, and you left the room, then should you decide to eat again in the other room, or decide to come back and eat, you have to make a new bracha ha'motzi, and not only that, you have to wash again.
Even if you come back?
Even if you come back. Because we assume when you left, considering you decided you're done eating, you're no longer guarding your hands from the cleanliness that they acquired when you started, and therefore, should you decide to continue eating, you have to wash again. This is where we left off. Yeah. Now, what happens? And here's an interesting case. Comes out to Rebbe. It's the 1, 2, 3rd paragraph in Halacha Zayin. So there's a big red Zayin, and then paragraph 3. Vafilu. Vafilu even. While you see you did not divert your attention from eating. That's literally the translation, which means you left the room for personal concern, which means you shouldn't have, but you did. Right? Because you're supposed to bench in the spot before you leave. You're not going for a mitzvah, you're going for personal issues. But you left anyway. Now, when you left, you thought you were going to continue eating, but you got into a conversation with someone. You actually left with the intention of eating in the other room. Or maybe you decided that you'll come back and just go, let's say hello to someone and come back and eat. Right? In which case, that's the whole halacha here, no new bracha. That was the original halacha we're learning in psachim. Because the halacha anchors you to the place and so on. But in this case now, im hiflik harbe b'dvarim, you really spent a long time in conversation. So you went to say hello to a friend, and it ended up being a long conversation. So what now? So let's assume the food didn't digest. It wasn't 72 minutes. But it's a good 30-minute conversation. Right? So the requirements to not make a new bracha hamoitzi have been met. It's less than 72 minutes, and you knew you were going to continue eating.
Yeah.
But there's another problem. The other problem is the washing of the hands. Because you've been so long away from your meal, we cannot assume that you guarded your hands to not touch anything that would require you to wash again. And therefore, you have to go and wash your hands again. Even though you're not making a bracha hamoitzi. You're not making a new hamoitzi because your meal is not over. But you're washing your hands again because you no longer have been guarding your hands to keep them clean for your eating because you just chatted with your buddy for half an hour outside. Right? We can safely assume you have not paid proper attention to keep your hands clean the entire time because you've been chatting all that time. So even though there's no new bracha hamoitzi because your meal is not over, because it's the kinds of things that halacha requires you to come back so you're anchored to you halachically. You had it when you left, you thought you were going to continue eating. The food hasn't digested, so your meal isn't over, even though you shouldn't have left the room, but you did. So no new hamoitzi when you come back. But washing your hands, yes, because we cannot assume you, throughout the entire conversation, you didn't scratch your head or do something that requires you to wash your hands again. So a new netilas yadayim. Quite something.
You do netilas yadayim, you say.
So he says, you make it, or do you make the bracha?
Yeah.
I assume so.
I know that sometimes when there's some people, when they interrupt between washing and hamotzi, they wash their hands again.
But no bracha. You know, we have to look up. It says here to look up. He says this is all explained in chapter Kuf Samach Dal. That's 174. So you have to look that up there.
The other thing I wanted to know is, how do you determine what's considered long in terms of the time frame?
Good question.
I mean,
doesn't answer. Doesn't say.
Sounds like 30 minutes.
I just made up 30 minutes, but it doesn't say.
30 minutes.
Doesn't say.
There's a few benchmarks.
I imagine it's
with regard to time.
I know there is, but I imagine over here.
Much shorter.
But here it comes down to, like, when you're done the conversation, you look back and you say, "What did I do with my hands?" And you're unaware, go wash again.
Oh yeah. Or where have you been?
Or where have you? Yeah.
If you just went to another room.
Maybe if you went to the other room and you were chatting, but like you ask yourself, no, it's also most of it is we're concerned with what parts of your body you touch.
Yeah.
If you touch parts of your body that are normally covered or sweaty or scratch your head,
you
shake your hands with
or something. So if you're unaware what your hands did for the last during the conversation, I would imagine that's considered.
That's a good.
That's right. That's the thing. That's the logic here. The logic here is that you know that you're engrossed in conversation and no longer okay. And we assume you haven't guarded your hands to keep them clean,
right.
To keep them halachically clean.
It's one of those factors that may discontinue the meal, but not so.
Not discontinue the meal, but undo your washing.
But right, just
the meal hasn't discontinued, right? That's the.
So just to as far as washing the hands.
Even though there's no new hamoitzi, because the meal isn't over, but you're no longer focused on.
Right.
On your hands. Okay. Now that's how it continues. Lofi mashin is bar b'simin tzadik beis. No, sorry, I skipped the paragraph. There's those that say Shehu Adin, the same law applies. If you stood up and you went to go daven in the middle of your meal, which you mentioned before, that's actually when you're allowed to, because it's a mitzvah.
It's a mitzvah, right?
And if it's the only way you're going to get a minyan, it's a mitzvah veres. It's a mitzvah that if you don't take it now, you'll lose out.
Time bound.
It's a time-bound mitzvah because the minyan may not be available later. Or let's say fractionally it's not going to be available later.
So you're at a wedding, Suda.
So you go daven. So that say you have to then again wash your hands again when you come back to the meal. Because we are concerned that you may have diverted your attention from keeping your hands clean while you're focusing on your prayer. Unless you actually were mindful of your hands, which you mean that would be another case in which you would wash your hands, but not make a no hamaitzi. You're not making a no hamaitzi because your meal is not over and you're allowed to leave. This is even less detached than the person going out for a conversation. Because in the conversation thing, you were not supposed to leave until you benched. With the minyan, you were allowed to. But nonetheless, there is this view which says we're concerned that in your focusing on your davening, you're not focused on maintaining your hands' state of cleanliness. Unless what? Oh, so that's why he says here, we're not, in the case where you're conversed for a long time, we assume you did not control your hands. When it comes to davening, he says, there might be the concern that in your prayer you were not mindful of your hands. But if you know you were mindful of your hands, it's okay. Because you're right, during davening, one should be mindful of their hands, at least to some degree.
Yeah, and then it was before davening, you did well.
That's right. Now here come. That's right.
About during davening.
That's right. But Alter Rebbe cites a parallel. Pesach, just like we find with the night of the Seder. Right? Washing your hands, we think of washing our hands primarily for eating bread. But in halacha, washing your hands is the same thing for if you're eating something that's wet, a food that's been made wet. Right? So, you wash your hands at orchatz before you dip your karpas into salt water. Right? You have to wash your hand again by rachza. Why? It's the same ritual washing.
You said it's because we touched something wet.
So,
and that can transmit.
That which is wet is more susceptible to impurity, but we're not concerned with impurity today. It's the reason why we use that as something to remind us of what impurity is, because that was the kind of thing that would have been part of impurity.
The source.
Yeah, not a source, but it's a high transmission, at least rabbinically speaking. Something that's wet transmits at a high level.
Right.
So we use that as a way, the whole washing our hands before meals, to remember the impurity, the issues of the laws of purity and impurity that used to be. In temple times, people do not wash their hands for bread. Why should you? Unless you're going to the temple to eat, then you're going to mikvah, whatever, you have to wash your hands there. But otherwise, most people were not doing that. The sages instituted the washing of the hands so that we don't forget what used to be a big part of our lives, which is ritual purity. So they instituted that, A, before you eat bread, B, before you eat something that's dipped in liquid. Because something that's dipped in liquid would have been the kind of thing that would have transmitted impurity.
We don't really follow the liquid part.
We should. We should. The reason we don't is because you can get around it by not touching it. If you eat with a fork, you don't need to wash your hands.
That's the custom.
Although, okay, whatever. We discussed that. I think when we learned about the Seder, we discussed in different commentaries that discuss whether there's leniency to not, because there is at least a Tosfos is an opinion which says that they're washing your hands for dipping is no longer, whatever. So there is an opinion we can rely on to be lenient, which is why we don't. We discussed it when we learned the night of the Seder. Sorry? There's one opinion. No, there's one opinion that says that doesn't apply.
Oh, okay.
So you can rely on that opinion.
You can rely on
At any rate, the point that I was making here is when you wash your hands at orchatz before you dip the karpas in the salt water, it's the same ritual washing that you're going to be doing later at rachza before you eat your matzah. So I do it twice. Just wash your hands at the beginning. Make a bracha. We don't make the bracha on when we wash for orchatz, because of this whole business that it might not be, that because there's an opinion which says you don't have to wash, so we're lenient, we wash without a bracha. Fine. So why not just make a bracha and make one washing for your dipping and then for your matzah?
Well,
What's the reason?
Is it because of what we're learning?
Again, exactly.
That we may not recall what we've done with our
Correct.
hands in the interim.
You're sitting and reading the Haggadah, singing songs with your family for an hour and a half while your kids are singing the Manishtana and you're doing all this stuff. We're going to assume that you safely guarded your hands the entire time. Probably not. So wash again. So here's an example of where you interrupted your meal, not with respect to a meal because you haven't eaten bread yet, but you interrupted your washing with doing a prayer-like activity, and yet we assume you didn't guard your hand. So similarly, if in the middle of a meal you went to go daven with a minion, when you come back, you should wash again because we're concerned that during your davening you weren't guarding your hands, just like we're concerned that you weren't guarding your hands during the Haggadah. Okay? Another paragraph.
So remarkable that during the Black Plague that was very much against them. Realize why we were not giving many people.
Yeah.
What was instituted was remarkable.
More Jews died in the pogroms after the Black Plague than the Black Plague itself, because we were blamed for causing it. I was actually just reading recently that there are some historians that are questioning whether we actually died in less numbers. But for generations, at least that was the history, that we died in less numbers. And the theory is because we washed our hands. And another theory is because we salted our meat. Those are the two theories. But I actually just read recently. It was a bit of a letdown, actually. Some postmodern historians that question whether we actually died in less numbers. I like to believe we did. But anyway, we definitely died in higher numbers in the pogroms that came after. Yeah. Anyway, okay, let's learn one more paragraph. Based on that which we explained in chapters 92, Sha'ikr, that the primary view is, the primary halacha follows the view that in the same way you have to keep your attention to keep your hands clean during eating. You also have to keep your hands clean and keep attention during davening. This is to your point. So according to this opinion, during davening, we assume you're guarding your hands. And according to that opinion, if you interrupted your meal by davening, you don't have to wash again. Because prayer itself tells you don't move your hands around into places you shouldn't. Now, if that's the case, how come by the Haggadah you're washing again? When it comes to the Haggadah, diverting your attention from the Haggadah does not invalidate your reading of the Haggadah. When you're davening, if you divert your attention from your hands, from your cleanliness, it invalidates your davening, and you have to go wash again and daven again. When it comes to Haggadah, there's no such rule. And therefore, when it comes to davening, we actually assume you guard your hands more than during Haggadah. And it would make sense. Just think of yourself during davening Shemona Esrei. You're standing at attention, your hands are where they're supposed to be, in one place. You're davening. When it comes to Haggadah, you're sitting with your family, kids are moving, you're passing things around, you're singing a song. This kid's reading the Manishtana, and this guest needs this thing, and one person's running to the bathroom. The Haggadah is a happening scene.
Yeah.
To assume you're guarding your hands throughout all that, the halacha doesn't even require you to. But when it comes to davening, you're standing in one place. You're saying Shemona Esrei. Your mind frame is very different during davening than it is during the Haggadah. You're standing at attention with your feet together, right? So interrupting with davening doesn't constitute diverting attention from your hands, and therefore, because we follow this view that during davening you are to guard your hands, we assume you did guard your hands, and therefore, if you interrupted your meal with davening, you don't need to wash again. But because over here you interrupted your washing with Haggadah, then you do have to wash again, because Haggadah doesn't have that same kind of weight that tells you must guard your hand the entire time. And therefore, when it comes to Haggadah, we are concerned that you diverted your attention, you have to wash again. But this is all with respect to washing the hands. With the bracha hamoitzi, you don't need to make a new bracha hamoitzi. Even if you left your house and went to shul next door to daven, and you were there for quite a while, for the whole 25 minutes of the minyan. Mincha. So long as when you left, you knew that you're going to continue eating when you come back. The davening does not constitute an interruption in your meal. Even if you're compelled to stop and daven, because you're running out of time. The mincha time is up in 20 minutes, you have to go daven now. Even though during davening you may not eat. Nonetheless, this does not constitute an interruption. And in fact, as you mentioned before, you're allowed to. You're allowed to leave to go daven with the minion during your meal. And so long as A, you knew you were going to continue eating when you're done. B, it wasn't so long that it caused the food to digest. When you come back, no hamaitzi. Even if according to some opinions, you have to wash again. But as we just learned, the primary opinion is you don't have to wash again. Now, finally, the last paragraph in Zion, davening is not comparable to benching in this regard, where when you bench, that is definitely interruption in your meal. And then when you drink the cup of wine upon which you benched, after you bench, you have to make a gofen. Because benching is an interruption in your meal, even though davening is not. Because during benching, you cannot drink wine. But why is it that you can't drink wine during benching? It's not the same thing as why you can't drink during davening. The reason why you can't drink during davening or eat during davening is not because you've interrupted your meal. It's because davening requires that you talk to Hashem without eating in the middle. What's the reason why you can't eat and drink in the middle of benching? Much more than just because you're talking to God. But because benching itself is the ultimate break in your meal. And therefore, when you bench, even though you know you're going to be drinking that glass of wine right after benching, you still have to make a bracha gofen on that benching. Because the benching is, you have to make a bracha gofen on that glass of wine, because the benching is the absolute end of your meal. This is not true of prayer. Even though you may not eat during prayer, but prayer itself does not necessarily on its own constitute a break in the meal. And therefore, when you broke up your meal with davening in the middle, you come back, you continue eating. Even though there's an opinion which says you should wash, but you don't have to. Okay, so now all of this, everything we said till now, was according to the opinion of the Gemara that there's a difference between whether you walked away from something that the halacha requires you to come back or not. But there's another opinion of the Gemara, the opinion of our Sheshis, that even when you walked away from a meal, you still have to make a new bracha in the new place. Remember, there was that one opinion. So we have to introduce that and how we figure out to try to validate all the halachic views as best we can, and that, God willing, coming tomorrow. And as I mentioned in this next paragraph in the halacha ches, there's a parenthesis that's going to throw a wrench in a lot of what we learned. So stay tuned for that. Okay, wonderful day, Yiddi. We should hear good news and comforting news for the whole community and for everyone.
Amen.